I'm Melody Russell. You're watching Asked and Answered.
Podcast or this YouTube show is a spinoff for what we did under the Barristers Executive Committee of Alameda County Bar Association. So we spun it off and decided to do our own thing. But one of the things that we've worked on with this particular team is kind of a new series, right? And I admit that I'm probably the biggest proponent and sort of came up with the idea, but it is basically influenced by Derek Bell's Faces at the Bottom of the Well. So we started a series where we tell stories, tell them based on race, and we set the context in about a legal question, but really we're looking for stories and personal anecdotes. So we've done one called Black Stories. We've done one called Latinx Stories. Our next one, we're doing one called Black Women Veteran Stories, under the United States Military Code. We have another one scheduled called Japanese Stories. Stories, from specifically, we've set it up in the context of Executive Order 9066. We've enlisted you or asked you, really conscripted is what I would say, but we've asked you to be on the panel. But can you talk a little bit about that? Executive Order 966, educate people about it, your personal, experiences. You'll be talking about it more in depth, but I'd just like to throw it out there.
Well, Executive Order 9066 was the initial legal order coming from then President Roosevelt, ordering the initial essential separation of Japanese had to leave their homes into confined space, given very short notice. Essentially, most Japanese Americans lost virtually almost everything in terms of property and houses and things, because it wasn't clear or possible to necessarily maintain the old way of life. The executive order was subsequently, in legal terms, was subsequently followed by legislation which confirmed the executive order, so that there wasn't any question of the legality of the order itself, that there was congressional legislation to support it. And in terms of what it meant for people's lives was Japanese Americans were sent to detention areas within localities. So in Stockton, my parents were sent to the San Joaquin County Fairgrounds and housed in the stables. And so that was where Japanese Americans were sent. And then subsequently, after several months, there were established the semi-permanent, more fixed actual detention centers, the camps. And they were in California, for example, excuse me, in Manzanar, in the eastern Sierra Nevadas, on the other side of the Sierras, toward the desert, and in the north in Tule Lake, again a very remote area near the Oregon border, was another detention center, and then roughly, I forget the exact number, 9 or 11 others scattered throughout the United States. My parents were then sent by train to Rower, Arkansas. And so that was where they spent over 2 years, I believe, forget the exact number of months, in Rower in a camp, in a semi-permanent camp. Um, and there is an interesting film called Come See the Paradise. It's available, I believe, I haven't checked lately, by Alan Parker. And the part that I actually used to show to some of my classes is there's a 15-minute sort of what happened to the families. They went from suddenly discovering this not suddenly, after Pearl Harbor, there was an immediate period of fear. And then a few months later, the executive order ordered into detention centers in horse racetracks and a number of racetracks around California, and then sent by train with closed seal trains with with the windows and shades closed to various places, and 2 in Arkansas, Utah, Wyoming, 2 in California, Arizona, and very remote areas. And it was administered, oddly enough, by an ad hoc agency staffed by members of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, people who had some experience in the bureaucracy of establishing a detention facility. So that was, so Japanese were sent there. My parents spent 2 years there in camp with, as you can imagine, they were like, each camp had between from I think 6,000 to 12,000 people. So these were many cities. They were not sort of like little small areas. And this full evacuation had followed immediately after the war. The roundup and seizure of thousands of Japanese American community leaders. So this had been a major effort. They're primarily the immigrants and all of the traditional leadership, the Buddhist churches, the regional associations, the family associations, well, mainly regional associations. That leadership, Japanese immigrant, was largely sent to separate, initially sent to separate prison facilities. Many of them were actually imprisoned, which was before the executive order, the actual evacuation. And then the camps were finally dismantled after a series of legal challenges. Not Korematsu and Hirabayashi, the 2 cases which upheld it, but the Endo case, which basically sort of said, well, okay, it doesn't appear to be any reason for doing this any longer. And that's a bad summary. But the case then led to the dismantling of the camps themselves. And so then Japanese Americans scattered across the country, majority returned to California, but to a very hostile California. Others, so the modest Japanese American communities in Chicago, in Utah, in Colorado, were the result of having been dispersed out from mainly California to various parts of the United States. And of course, in the different story in Hawaii, Hawaii was, I forget the population was at that point like a third Japanese American. And so it really wasn't possible. So there was a heavy surveillance and imprisonment of some of the community leaders. But for the most part, the population was not interned and sent into camps because you couldn't lock up, a third of the island. It was impossible in Hawaii. And so, but that's sort of the summary version. And anecdotally, in personal terms, right, I grew up with my parents talking about camp, right? And I'll still use this term. I'll say something about, we were with my daughter-in-law, we're talking about making beds. And so I folded the beds the sheets in military fashion. And I said, I learned it from my mother who learned it in camp. And there was this pause where she had this sort of like, camp, you mean summer camp? And then she realized, oh no, I meant the Japanese internment concentration camps. That this was the military style supervision not military style, military supervision, as well as then the War Relocation Authority Administration supervision. And making beds was a part of the routine in the essentially barracks for families. So so camp was a part of what we grew up with. And there would be a reference to a friend or an acquaintance say, oh yeah, we met them in camp, or no, that was after camp. So the consciousness about what does the government do to people, we grew up with a very different, Japanese Americans grew up, my generation, with a very different consciousness. This was a part of what happened to you, and everything was measured before and after camp.
Thanks everyone for watching Asked and Answered. If you like this series, if you like what you've seen and what you've heard, smash that like button and subscribe.